We'll get started here. Thanks everybody for coming tonight to a water talk. The focus of our water talk tonight is PFAS in our waterways. Um, Go ahead and show you the agenda tonight. So I figured we could all do just a quick round of introductions. Since we don't have a huge group here, whether you want to put it in the chat or popcorn around. Can feel free to unmute and just do a brief introduction if you feel comfortable. I'll give a quick background on our monitoring program at Upstream Pittsburgh, and then we'll have a presentation by Jess Friss from Three Rivers Waterkeeper on their monitoring of forever chemicals in our waterways. And then that'll be followed by presentation by Emily Woodward from the USGS, forever chemicals, and an overview of PFAS monitoring projects by the USGS in Pennsylvania. So I will go ahead and just do a quick introduction. I know I put it in the chat. I'm Aaron Birdie. I'm the Plan Build Coordinator at Upstream Pittsburgh. I lead our monitoring program and interested in learning, continuing to learn about PFAS and other emerging pollutants. And yeah, I will pass it over to Rose.
Hi everyone, Rose Flowers. I'm the Environmental Education Manager with Upstream Pittsburgh, and I go around to talk to lots of folks all over the place, so I'm excited to learn more about PFAS and share what I know with the crew.
Guess we can go to Jess. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Jess. I'm the Director of Community Programs at Three Rivers Waterkeeper, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about the specific monitoring that we've done and a little bit about PFAS chemicals in general.
And Emily, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm Emily Woodward. I'm a scientist at the USGS Pennsylvania Water Science Center based out of Bridgeville. And yeah, really excited to talk about some of the work we're doing at PFAS in southwestern Pennsylvania and across the state.
Anybody else want to go? If not, I can go ahead. It's up to you guys. All right. Cool. So the monitoring and data efforts that we kind of have going on at Upstream Pittsburgh, we've been collecting grab samples and 9 mile runs since 2014. Those are for more standard analysis for metals and nutrients. And we also use a handheld sonde to get pH, dissolved oxygen, and some of those other general parameters for water quality at 3 sites on a monthly basis. It's not PFAS monitoring, but it's just what we do. So I figured I'd throw it in here as well. We also do macroinvertebrate sampling to understand what kind of critters live in the stream bed, which can indicate the health of a stream or the poor health of a stream too. And then also annual fish surveys in partnership with Duquesne and Chatham universities. We also recently have been rolling out a green stormwater infrastructure monitoring program to focus on the rain gardens in the upper watershed and 9 mile run that we are monitoring to understand how they perform and how we can better design projects to capture more rainwater, filter more pollutants, and generally lead to a healthier watershed. So it's just a slide showing my coworker Keith Moore and myself doing the monthly grab sampling at one of our sites. Below that is one of our rain gardens. This is in our watershed. Water flows in and infiltrates here before overflowing into some subsurface storage. And then on the right is our green infrastructure monitoring dashboard where can learn a little bit more about how the different rain gardens are performing. This screenshot I took actually from the storm that we had over the weekend. So you can see the rainfall in blue, and then corresponding spikes in depth within the rain garden on the graph. So that's just a brief overview of the projects that we do at Upstream related to monitoring and data. And we're really interested to, or excited to have Jess and Emily share their research on PFAS. So go ahead and give it over to Jess if you're ready to share your screen and present. Get going into the main presentations.
All right, I just shared my screen, so hopefully you guys can see that. If not, let me know. But yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about forever chemicals in our waterways. That's what PFAS chemicals are typically called. My name is Jess. I'm the director of community programs, like I said, at Three Rivers Waterkeeper. This lovely photo on the left is our Waterkeeper boat, which is what we go out and patrol the rivers on. So just a little bit about our organization. Three Rivers Waterkeeper, our mission is to protect the water quality of the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers and their respective watersheds. And our vision is simple. It's just to have drinkable, fishable, swimmable waters in the watershed. We're a part of a global alliance, so there are waterkeepers all over the world who have the same mission and vision for the specific watersheds that they work in. And here on the right, you can see another picture of Evan, our waterkeeper in the boat. In this picture, I believe we're up in Beaver around the Shell plant doing some water sampling and patrols. So just a little bit of a general basic overview of what PFAS chemicals are. PFAS, PFAS, is an acronym, and it actually stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. A lot of people kind of think that PFAS are like one chemical, but it's actually a group of human-made chemicals that are widely used in a lot of consumer products. And they were specifically made to resist heat, oil, water. So they're in a lot of things that we use, like our waterproof coats, nonstick cookware. Most commonly, a lot of people have heard about them in firefighting foam. And they're often referred to as forever chemicals because they really don't break down in nature, and they accumulate to these greater and greater concentrations. And they're known to have health risks to them, which is why they're a concern, because they don't break down and they have health risks. And this can be things like cancer, liver and kidney disease, reproductive issues, immunodeficiencies, hormone disruptions, and more. And because these chemicals are kind of so new, in the sense, there's really not too much known about the long-term effects of them. And that's why they're kind of classified as an emerging contaminant of concern. And you may have seen recently in the news that the EPA proposed a regulation on PFAS, actually. So it's considered a national primary drinking water regulation. And they are choosing to establish legally enforceable levels, also known as maximum contaminant levels, MCLs, for 6 PFAS chemicals in our drinking water. So 2 of the key things to note from there is that they're only going to regulate and enforce 6 PFAS chemicals, and only in drinking water. You can see listed out here the chemicals that they will be regulating. So PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and so on. You can see here that they have proposed maximum contaminant levels of about 4 parts per trillion. And another thing about this proposed ruling is that they would require these public water systems to monitor for these chemicals, notify the public of the levels of these chemicals, and to reduce the levels of the PFAS chemicals in our drinking water if they exceed these proposed standards. So for PFOA, that would be like 4 parts per trillion. So this is kind of important because this is really the first time that PFAS chemicals will be legally enforceable at this level. And a lot of states before the EPA decided that they were gonna have this regulation, kind of got ahead of the curve and decided that they were going to have their own state rule. So Pennsylvania, as of January 14th, actually has their own PFAS ruling already. And it went into effect, like I said, January 14th, but it's only for 2 PFAS chemicals. So that PFOA and PFOS. And this was made effective, and they are anticipating for this initial monitoring to kind of start next year in 2024. But you can kind of tell, so Pennsylvania's ruling, they decided that they were going to set a maximum level of 14 parts per trillion for PFOA, and about 18 parts per trillion for PFOS. And if you remember, the EPA is going to set that at 4 parts per trillion, meaning that Pennsylvania's rule is going to be way higher than the EPA's. So let's bring it a bit closer to the monitoring that Three Rivers Waterkeeper specifically does. So we have tested for PFAS. We typically test for PFAS chemicals as a result of something happening. Here you can see on the left in this picture is our executive director, Heather. We're doing some water sampling. This was specifically in Westmoreland County. So we do collect passive samples in our waterways for about 55 PFAS chemicals, and we use CycloPure water test kits to do our water sampling for PFAS chemicals. In addition to testing for PFAS chemicals, we also do a lot of other water sampling along our rivers and tributaries, for things like BTEX, metals, all that stuff. And we are working with the Pittsburgh Water Collaborative to do other water sampling. And you can kind of maybe see Pennsylvania, our little dot in Pittsburgh, of water sampling in this larger chart. So we were actually, Three Rivers Waterkeeper was a part of a national study of PFAS chemicals in our waterways through the Waterkeeper Alliance. And it was one of the first studies done to kind of show how much PFAS is found in waterways across the US. And you can see that there's a large concentration on the coast, on our coast. And we're right here where Pittsburgh is. That's our sampling. And I'll talk a little bit about the sampling that we did for that. But to go in depth, I'm going to talk about 2 specific times that we did PFAS testing. One, you may be familiar with the Harmer train derailment that happened May of last year. And then I'll talk a little bit about when we did testing at the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill when there was a leachate spill. So here's just more pictures of us doing water sampling in this region, specifically PFAS sampling. So the Harmer train derailment happened in May on a tributary right next to the Allegheny, and it caused some chemicals to spill into the waterways, and it also caused nurdles. So these plastic pellets in the bottom photo here, pre-production plastic pellets to go into the waterway. And we were concerned about PFAS because, like I mentioned earlier, it's found in firefighting foam, which could have been used at the derailment site. So we did some testing at on the Allegheny, both upstream and downstream of the derailment. Here's a picture from Google Maps. You can see the pink star is like where the derailment happened. And then we'd sampled upstream. And from that, we found about 1.1 parts per trillion of specifically PFOS. And then we did some downstream sampling and found that PFOS went from 1.1 parts per trillion to 3.5 parts per trillion. And there were 2 additional PFAS chemicals found in the waterways, PFOA and PFBS, at 1.6 parts per trillion and 1.10 parts per trillion, respectively. So that was, and this specifically was the sampling that we did that ended up in the nationwide study for PFAS in our waterways. And then just to compare that data, the downstream data, to the ruling to see kind of what is because as many of you may know, we do get our drinking water from the rivers. So whatever the whatever PFAS chemicals are in our rivers is going to be at the intake of these water treatment facilities, which now through the proposed ruling, these water treatment facilities are going to have to test the water and then make sure that that PFAS level is below the MCL. So you can see we found for PFOA specifically, we had 1.6 parts per trillion, but that's below Pennsylvania's MCL and also below EPA's proposed MCL. And then for PFOS, that was 3.5 parts per trillion. So kind of really close to EPA's proposed MCL of 4.0 parts per trillion. One thing that's really important to mention too is that water sampling and sampling of the river in general is kind of difficult because the river is so vast. When chemicals enter the waterway, they dilute, they could sit on the surface, they can sink. And so taking one grab sample of the waterway in just one area is not always, going to tell you the full story of everything that's going on in that river. It's just what's happening in that little section of the river at that exact time. The next little sampling session I'd like to mention is at the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill. This is a landfill that sits along the Mon River, kind of down in Bell Vernon, if anyone's familiar with that area. It is a large landfill that takes in fracking waste, and fracking waste is known to contain PFAS chemicals in a study that was done. So because this fracking waste, because they frack with PFAS and then the waste is then put in the landfill, when it rains or when the landfill, the trash that's in there kind of decomposes, it creates this liquid known as leachate, kind of also known as landfill tea. It's kind of gross if you think about it. It's just this liquid that comes from everything that sits in a landfill. And because this leachate has liquid from fracking waste, it can also contain PFAS chemicals. And last year in August, the landfill reported a leak of their leachate that they keep in these containers that had broke open and spilled into Spears Run, which is a tributary of the Mon River. So we went out and sampled both upstream of the leak, downstream of the leak, and then at the Mon River. And this is all of the data that we got back. So you can see our different testing. So upstream, also everything that's yellow is at a detectable limit. So you can see that there's, a little bit upstream, a lot directly downstream, and then kind of a little bit at the Mon River. The biggest thing to note is that directly downstream from the leachate spill, the testing that we did found 16 different PFAS chemicals with a total concentration of 126.8 parts per trillion, which is a big jump from upstream where it was only 16.1 parts per trillion. And then again, compared directly to EPA's proposed MCL, you can see that directly downstream, the PFOA concentration is above Pennsylvania's limit at 14 parts per trillion and way above EPA's limit of 4.0 parts per trillion. Again, the data for PFAS, specifically PFOS, 6.6 parts per trillion was sampled. Pennsylvania said at 18 parts per trillion was their MCL. Okay, 6.6 is beneath that, but above the EPA's MCL. Now, why does this kind of matter what the water sampling was when I mentioned earlier that the proposed ruling is just for drinking water and we're sampling the river? Well, remember, we get our drinking water from the river, and there's a lot of challenges that we face with these PFAS regulations because there are no guidelines for effluent discharge into our waterways. So these industries that have outfalls, there's no limit as to how much PFAS chemicals they can be putting into the waterways right now. There's no limit that says this is the amount of PFAS chemicals that you can have in the waterways before it gets to drinking water. There's only ruling proposed right now on the limits that it is when it gets into these water treatment facilities. So this is kind of a concern because it leaves the ratepayers, so the people like us who pay for our water, who pay for our sewage, to kind of pay to have these contaminants cleaned out of the water so that they are underneath the EPA's proposed limit. This is not a guarantee, but if, the water authority is having to spend way more money now because of this ruling to clean out the water, who knows? So our next step is to kind of propose, hope that there is regulation as to what can enter our waterways, because the system already exists. Industries have to have permits for what they put into the waterways, called NPDES permits, NPDES, the National Pollution Elimination Systems. So if we could regulate what industries are putting into the water related to PFAS chemicals, it would make it a lot easier for PFAS chemicals to not enter the waterways. And then specifically what can be done on a human level. So the EPA is taking comments on the proposed regulation, so you can make a public comment yourself before May 30th. I've included the docket number, but I'm sure we can drop links in the chat or anything, and anyone is welcome to make a public comment on their thoughts on the EPA's proposed regulation. Or you may find that an organization that you follow is already making a comment that you can sign on to. You can also attend EPA's hearing on the PFAS regulation that's happening on May 4th. I made like a bit.ly link for it because I think the EPA, their link is like an Eventbrite and it was like really long. So I made like a shortened link to use. And you can also join in on efforts to get businesses to ban PFAS chemicals in their manufacturing. So kind of from the start. So for example, Toxic Free Future is an organization that we've worked with through Break Free from Plastics. And they were successful in getting REI to announce a ban on using PFAS chemicals in all of their textiles. So you can kind of go to their website and see what campaign they're going to work on next and get on it. And then lastly, you can come to one of our upcoming events. We're having a community listening session in different communities all around Pittsburgh. So if you have concerns about PFAS in the waterways, this is your chance to share them with us and let us know that that's something that we should be focusing on more. You can also come to Three Rivers Watch. That is a volunteer program that we have where we talk about how to spot and report water pollution. And we actually have one coming up May 6th, I believe, with Upstream Pittsburgh at 9 Mile Run that we're really excited about. So I can drop the link in the chat for that. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to what Three Rivers Waterkeeper is doing related to PFAS. If anyone has any chemical or has any questions, I'm sure we can answer them at the end, but I believe it's now Emily's chance to talk a little bit about the monitoring that they're doing. So thank you so much.
All
That
right.
was really interesting. Thanks, Jess. All right. Can you guys all see this presentation? Hopefully in presentation mode. Good.
Yep. Looks good.
Okay, so my name's Emily Woodward, and I'm a physical scientist at the Pittsburgh field office, part of the Pennsylvania Water Science Center at USGS. Just a little bit of background, kind of what I've worked on over the years. I mostly focus on research related to emerging contaminant fate and transport. So a lot of my PhD and postdoc work was on agrochemicals, looking at wastewater treatment plant effluent that was used to irrigate crops, and then just looking at different additives that were applied in cropping systems and looking at some of that agricultural runoff that occurs into streams near agricultural lands. I moved to Pennsylvania in 2021 to join the Pennsylvania Water Science Center. And since that move, my research focus has shifted from agrochemicals to PFAS. So in the world of emerging contaminants, your focus is always changing, I feel like, as new chemicals are being studied and becoming more concerning. So since 2021, I've really kind of shifted to this PFAS realm. So today I'm going to really talk about some of the big picture broad projects that we're working on at our center across the state of Pennsylvania. Some of them are focused in southwestern PA. A lot of them are also focused in the Philadelphia region. So just kind of a brief overview of some of the work that we're doing. Before I dive into the PFAS work, this may have been easier in an in-person setting, but I wanted to ask the audience kind of what do you think of when you think of the US Geological Survey? I sometimes feel like there's not a really good understanding of all of the different types of work that we do. So I'm going to pose that as a question for the group if you want to shout out or put something in the chat.
Hey there, this is Rose. This isn't probably what most people think of, but I love the survey markers. I love to kind of look around and try to find them in random places. And I'm always excited when I find one, and usually no one I'm with understands my excitement, but there you are.
I also love finding those, especially on hikes. I'm like, I gotta pose with the survey marker. No, that's a really good one. I see someone in the chat, John said earthquakes. Classic. Yep. So typically when people think about USGS, we're usually thinking about earthquakes and volcanoes, maps, survey markers, which we definitely do. That's a huge part of the geologic survey. Rocks, classic. But we also do a lot of other types of research and work. We do a lot of work related to resource management and extraction. We have an entire ecosystems branch that focuses on kind of data for biologic ecosystem kind of management questions. I don't know if anyone listens to some of the um, ologies podcast that I've heard some people on there that actually worked at the survey that were doing like bear research in Montana. I didn't even know we did bear research. So it's really neat, kind of the diverse realms of research that are going on at USGS. And one of the really big areas of work is around water. So thinking about water quantity and also thinking about water quality. We have an entire mission area dedicated to water resources. So that brings up my next question for the group. Kind of what do you think about or what comes to mind when you hear the term water quality? Oops.
I think of I think of safety. Yeah, safety.
Safety, I like that. I see in the chat drinkable water. Yeah, those are all definitely great answers. At USGS, when we think about water quality, we're definitely thinking about drinkable water. That's a big one. We're thinking about recreational water, so boating, fishing, swimming, being able to use water to recreate, and then also thinking about water from a wildlife habitat perspective for waterfowl, fish, any organism that's really utilizing that water as kind of a home base. So we're always thinking about all of these various aspects of water quality in the work that we do. So I wanted to highlight something that I think is rather unique about the state of Pennsylvania, and I didn't know about this until I actually lived here for a while and then left and came back, and I didn't even know about this till I came back and started working for USGS. But the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has established this water quality network for the state of Pennsylvania. So it's 178 sites that are distributed across the state. And as part of this water quality network, the USGS conducts sampling at these locations, so either on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. And we sample these sites for nutrients, metals, and various water quality chemistries. And sometimes these sites are utilized for emerging contaminant-based research like PFAS. So today I'll show you some of the projects we're working on or have worked on and how we've been able to utilize this network. And the really cool thing about this is with the DEP and with USGS, we're kind of dedicated to providing data for the public. So all of the samples that are collected and all of this data is publicly available either via the DEP website or the USGS website. So I think that's really neat that we have this fixed network that we can access and utilize. So it's a pretty amazing resource, I think. So as I mentioned, we've utilized that network to do PFAS studies, and we're here today to learn about PFAS. I think Jess did a really nice job giving an overview of PFAS. So some of this might be redundant, but I'm just gonna kind of maybe move a little quicker then through the next few slides. So this first slide is just kind of the PFAS timeline. We had synthesis or development in the 1940s, and then manufacturing really took off after that. We did have kind of a phase out of PFAS and PFOA because of health concerns, and we started to see some new replacement chemistries for those compounds. But because they're forever chemicals, because they're hard to break down, we're definitely still seeing PFAS and PFOA in the environment, even though there was kind of this push for a phase out of those chemicals in manufacturing. When you hear talks about PFAS or read papers, I feel like the number of chemicals in this class is always changing. So when I made this slide, I saw something that referenced 4,000 PFAS compounds in this class. And just last week, I heard someone give a talk and say there are more than 9,000 compounds. So it's a huge class of compounds. We're really trying to wrap our head around it. I think our what we call target methods, or methods that we're running on samples, typically are only able to analyze for 40, maybe 50 compounds out of thousands. So we're really just kind of scraping the surface of what's out there. I've included a few images of some of the structures specifically for PFAS and PFOA, just to show you what these look like. I don't want to get too heavy into the chemistry, but you have these fluorinated carbon chains. So you kind of see they're just kind of like a chain with a what we call a head or a functional group on the end. And that chain, those carbon fluorine bonds are really strong, and that's what's really hard to break apart. So sometimes that functional group, depending on the compound, might break off or interact with soil or interact with fish tissue, but it's that chain that's kind of that resistant component of the compound. And then again, Jess did a really nice job discussing some of the PFAS sources. So this is kind of just a figure showing you some of those common sources. So we know household products, treatments on maybe carpet or furniture, Teflon pans, food wrappers. The firefighting foam is a big one. So we study that a lot in southeastern Pennsylvania near one of the main military bases in that region. Wastewater treatment plant effluent. And it's kind of overwhelming sometimes to think about all the sources. I have days where it can be really frustrating when I go around my house and I'm like, what am I doing? But we all do the best that we can to kind of limit our interaction with some of these things. And then again, I'll keep this brief because I think we heard a really good overview of the different MCLs that are out there and the different concerns from a human and ecological perspective in terms of PFAS contamination. I'd say it's kind of almost feels like it's like the Wild West in regulatory framework right now around PFAS. We have the state MCLs, we've got the new proposed EPA MCLs, and I'm guessing that this is where the EPA will land with final MCLs, but I don't know. Things seem to be changing all the time. I kind of feel like we're at the forefront right now. So they're keeping us on our toes, that's for sure. So at USGS, we have a group dedicated to PFAS research called the Integrated Science Team, PFAS Integrated Science Team. And they recently released this document, which was a strategic vision for PFAS research at USGS. So essentially, what this document did was kind of synthesize what is out there around PFAS in the literature and where are the remaining research gaps. And trust me, there are still a lot of research gaps. We have all kinds of questions around PFAS in the environment, from fate and transport, just occurrence data. There's a lot of research to be done. So this document is just kind of an overview of those major questions and what types of things USGS wants to focus on moving forward as an agency. So in Pennsylvania, we've tried to tackle some of those questions, and I'm going to highlight some of the studies that we're working on across the state. And that really started in 2019 when we did a statewide assessment of surface waters in Pennsylvania. So I mentioned that water quality network, the 178 sites across the state. So our agency, in conjunction with the DEP and a couple other local water groups out of the Southeast, took on this sampling campaign of all 178 sites, and samples were sent to a lab in Canada for PFAS analyses. So this is a really big effort, and I think it was one of the largest statewide efforts that happened like this across the country. And we have the data back from this effort, and it is publicly available, so you can access it on USGS within our database. And we also released a science-based, what we call a data release, which is just a link that I can share in the chat later. So anybody can look at this data from across the state. And I'm going to share maybe a figure from that on the next slide. But another big piece of this effort, this statewide study, was kind of developing our sampling protocols for PFAS for USGS. So USGS loves to have standard methods. We love to have standard lab methods. We love to have standard sampling methods. And with PFAS, we didn't have anything in our national field manual yet for how we should be sampling for these compounds. So a large part of this statewide study was developing those protocols, whether that's using, we usually use a 2-person team when we sample for PFAS, what we call a clean hands, dirty hands sampling procedure. So someone is dirty hands and only touches kind of the sampling equipment, and then the clean hands person is touching the sampling bottle only and like the clean sampling equipment that the sample's going into. And again, it's just so that we can try to prevent contamination from our clothes, from maybe if you touch something on the boat or you touch something that you're using to sample that might be contaminated. So we try to kind of really use a pretty strict protocols to make sure that we're not introducing anything into our sample. And another thing we worked through in the statewide assessment was kind of testing some of the equipment that we were using. So making sure that the churns that we use, that the sample bottles that we use and things like that aren't introducing PFAS. It, like we said, it's kind of overwhelming how many things have PFAS in them. So by doing some of this testing and looking at blanks, we're able to kind of feel confident in our methods that we're not introducing anything into our sample. So statewide assessment, really big on the sampling protocols. That sampling method will likely be published in the near future. I think that report is in draft, and that again will be publicly available. And then kind of again, just getting this unique data set for the state of Pennsylvania. So I'm only going to share this one figure from the statewide assessment. So this paper is actually currently in review at a scientific journal, but this is one of the figures in the paper that we submitted. And what you're seeing here, each triangle represents one of those sites, those 178 sites. The white triangles are low concentration, so we're looking at total PFAS. So if it's white, it's non-detect, we didn't see anything. And then as it fades from white to black, the concentrations are getting higher. So the dark black triangles would be our highest concentrations. So we saw that 76% of the sites we sampled had at least one PFAS detection. And there were 12 unique compounds detected across the state. I think at the time, the method we were using could look for 33 compounds. So we saw 12 out of 33 in our method. We tend to see the highest concentrations occurring in southeastern Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. And we know we have some sources in that region that are contributing PFAS to the environment. There's a former Navy base in that area that has used firefighting foams, and some of the testing that they're doing, which again, the Navy data is actually publicly available as well, shows PFAS in their outfalls from the base in the thousands of nanograms per liter. So it makes sense with that in the outfalls that we're going to see some high concentrations in streams near that base. And then there's also just some large scale wastewater treatment plants that are contributing to those stream inputs. So it's not surprising that we're seeing the concentrations in the Philadelphia region, and we have a lot of work focused in that region for this reason. But if you notice, we're also seeing a few dark triangles in that southwest area, kind of near the Mahonian and Beaver systems. So we do have some hits in this area, which could be linked to potentially landfills or wastewater treatment plants. And that's something that we're actually working on now. I'll touch on that on the next slide, just trying to figure out what those major sources might be in southwestern PA. Our maximum concentration in this study was 102 nanograms per liter, and that was at the Neshaminy, it's called Neshaminy Creek, which is again downstream of that Navy base that I mentioned in southeastern Pennsylvania. So as a result of that statewide study, we saw some hotspots, we saw some areas where we might be getting higher PFAS concentrations. We decided that we wanted to do something a little bit more focused and long-term. So that statewide study was just a one-off sampling event in September of 2019. So we ended up picking at first 20 sites, but now we're down to 16 sites across the state that we sample on a monthly basis for PFAS. So this is going to be a 5-year effort. We're in year 3 right now. So again, we're sampling monthly and we want to see maybe how those concentrations are changing seasonally. Do we see different compounds showing up in different parts of the state? And then a key piece of the study is also that we're including flow into the study. So looking at the size of the river and how much it flows to kind of get a sense of mass. So thinking about chemical loads or chemical masses that are coming into these streams from various sources. So this is something we're working on now. Aaron from Upstream Pittsburgh came out today and saw us sample one of the sites for this project. And like I said, we're in year 3, so we have 2 years to go, but we're just starting to work through some of the data from those initial 2 years and kind of think about what kind of potential trends are we already seeing. Another study that we recently completed was what we call a river continuum study. So this is where we're following a piece of water through the stream or through the reach, and we sample upstream and downstream of known source inputs. So we did this study in November of 2021, and this was in southeastern Pennsylvania near the Navy base that I mentioned. And then the reach that we sampled along was we also sampled upstream and downstream of 2 wastewater treatment plants. So the goal is to try to quantify the inputs from the Navy base and from the treatment plants. So again, we were sampling number 1 on this map is the upstream location down to number 12. And when you're following the same piece of water, you use the velocity of the stream and you figure out what time that piece of water would be at your next site. And then you go out and sample your next site at that specific time. So you're kind of, if you're seeing mass inputs or mass losses, you can kind of attribute that to maybe a tributary or a base outfall. It's kind of it's a better way to try to capture these source inputs so that you're, again, following that like same bolus as it moves throughout the system. The cool thing about this study is in addition to PFAS, we also analyzed water samples for pharmaceuticals, VOCs, major ions, and metals to try to help differentiate source inputs. So maybe if we see a lot of VOCs, that's indicating that that's maybe water that's coming from the base versus if we're seeing a lot of pharmaceuticals, maybe we're getting water from the treatment plant. And can we start to link some of these other chemistries with the PFAS that are showing up? In an ideal world, maybe you would be able to distinguish some type of source fingerprint or identifier so that if you saw that combination of compounds, that's coming from the Navy base or that's coming from the treatment plant. So this is a little bit more in the weeds with source attribution, but a really interesting study that we did in November of 2021 near that Navy base. And the last point, we're writing this work up right now, and I think most of it is publicly available on our database already, and then we're doing kind of that synthesis journal article prep as we speak. Another study that we're working on at USGS, this is actually focused mostly in southwestern Pennsylvania, is a PFAS and unconventional oil and gas waste study. And I think Jess had mentioned the fracking fluids with that leachate spill. So we know that this oil and gas waste does contain PFAS compounds. And typically the waste from production goes to an industrial treatment plant, which then goes to a wastewater treatment plant. And what we're wondering is, are there PFAS left after industrial treatment that are going into that wastewater treatment plant that are not removed during wastewater treatment plant processes? So we're sampling upstream and downstream of wastewater treatment plants that we know accept treated oil and gas waste. And we want to see if that PFAS signature downstream of the treatment plants that take oil and gas waste is higher than upstream or compared to treatment plants that do not take oil and gas waste. So we have 4 sites that take oil and gas waste that we're looking at. We have one control site that does not take oil and gas waste. This study just started this year, and they've done 2 of the sampling campaigns, and there will be 2 more before the year ends. So kind of a quarterly sampling effort. We're really excited to see the results from this. We recently were contacted by EPA to collaborate during one of the future sampling efforts to maybe get some more chemical analyses done on some of the water samples. Again, just giving us a clearer, more robust picture of contamination at these sites. Another study that we're working on is PFAS and surface water foams. So I noticed on Aaron's slide that he started with that there was foam on that surface water in the picture. I'm like, ooh, foam, like this is the study that I lead out of our office. And it's really interesting. I don't know how many people have you guys seen foam when you're out hiking or just seen it on streams and kind of wondered about foam in general and what it is and how it forms? I know I see it all the time, and and now that I'm studying it, I can't stop seeing it. But there's this question around foam formation, and then how foams can act as sinks for chemicals. So foams can form naturally from just organic matter that's in the environment. The formation of foam doesn't always have to be a negative connotation, but they can also form from surfactants in water, and they can also act as sinks for chemicals. So there are a couple papers out there that show concentrations of PFAS in these foams in the thousands of nanograms per liter range. So if we think back to the statewide surface water study that I mentioned, or some of the data that Jess shared, when we're thinking about surface water, our high concentrations are like 100 nanograms per liter. This is like 5,000, 9,000 nanograms per liter in the foam. So there's this sink potential, and then you have to wonder, when the foam dissipates or breaks down, is that re-released back into the stream? Or are there organisms in the water that are interacting with the foam that maybe are exposed to these high concentrations of PFAS? So this is a study that we started last summer. It's a 3-year study. It's in the Delaware River Basin. So in southeastern Pennsylvania, some of the sub-basins that we're focused on are, again, near that Navy base or near some of the treatment plants in that region. But essentially, we're just trying to look at the concentrations in the surface water versus the concentrations in foam in these various basins near known sources. There's not a lot of work out there right now on this, and just some of our preliminary data is already showing that this is definitely an environmental compartment that we need to be thinking about moving forward. And then finally, the last study I'm going to mention that we're working on kind of in Pennsylvania, but also in collaboration with another USGS lab, is looking at PFAS in fish, and more specifically looking at fish tissues and fish plasma. I put up this photo from the Neshaminy Creek Basin in southeastern Pennsylvania, where they have a do not eat fish advisory because of PFOS concentrations in fish. And I think there was a paper released recently nationwide that indicated fish contamination in different species of fish across the country. So this is definitely a realm of research that's important. And that lab in particular is working on the methods that we would use to, what we say, extract tissues or extract plasma and determine those concentrations of PFAS. So that I actually go down to that lab every month or two and help out with some of that methodology. So that's another thing we're working at in Pennsylvania. And all of these projects that I've mentioned today are really the focus of our center. But across USGS, there are so many more questions and so many more projects being done that, like I said, there's just all of these research gaps. So I just really was highlighting what we're doing in PA. My last few slides, just a couple wrap-up slides. I can drop these links or maybe share them via email with Aaron if you guys can distribute this. Our PFAS data release data set, there's a link to that if anybody wants to look at that statewide data set. That strategic vision, so PFAS questions that we have at USGS are things that we're trying to answer. And then I wanted to also include some web resources that I think are useful. The Pennsylvania DEP has a great PFAS website. CDC and EPA have great sites. And then the last one maybe is less familiar, is a group called the ITRC. And I actually reference this website all of the time during my daily work. And if I need to look something up or just get a refresher on a topic, I think that's probably one of my favorite PFAS websites. And then just kind of highlighting some of the cooperators that we work with at USGS. So we work closely with various state agencies, the Navy, the Air Force, other USGS groups like our water mission area. And then we also work with Orsanco and some of the groups out of West Virginia University. And then just wrapping up, thank you for listening. I hope that you found this interesting, and this is my contact information if you have questions about PFAS or USGS research. And then I also wanted to include our water quality specialist, Joe Duras. So Joe and I kind of co-lead all of the PFAS work out of our center. So if you ever have a question, you contact me, contact Joe, and we'll be able to either help or direct you kind of where you need to go. But thank you. That's all I have for today.
Thank you so much, Emily, for an informative talk, and for also having me out this morning for sampling. It was great to experience that. And yeah, I wanted to open it up now for any questions for Emily or Jess. Feel free to unmute, or if you're more comfortable dropping them in the chat, I can read them out loud. But we have ample time for questions, so ask away. Well, it looks
I
like
can
we
go.
have,
Oh, I say I can go ahead while you're looking at the chat, Erin, if you want.
yeah, go ahead,
So
Rose.
my question's for Jess. You mentioned the Cyclopure sampling kit. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, for sure. We use Cyclopure just because that's what the company that sponsored the water sampling that we did for the nationwide study through the Waterkeeper Alliance. It's actually really cool. They've developed this technology that I'm not super familiar with, but it's called like Dexorb. I can't remember. But basically the way that we sample through these Cyclopure kits is we get a grab sample of water and then allow the water to pass through this filter. And then the filter is what we mail back to Cyclopure, and they do the analysis for us. And I can actually drop a link in the chat. But because we haven't done PFAS testing regularly outside of targeted monitoring, we don't have like a specific way of analyzing PFAS chemicals. So using Cyclopure is like great for us. But we have sampled for PFAS also around the Shell plant. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and ask John's question. Thank you, Rose. John says, do fish show any unusual visual signs of PFAS contamination like lesions or growths? I guess I'll open it up to Emily and Jess. That one.
That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. So when I go down to the lab and work, I'm getting like a vial of like homogenized tissue or plasma that's been already removed. So I don't see the whole fish right now. And I'm not really a fish person. I'm more of a like chemistry type person, but it's definitely, I don't know, something I could look into. It'd be good for me to know about.
Cool. Well, one other question here from Christina. Did you sample the region around the latex chemical spill for the Delaware tributary in eastern Pennsylvania?
We have not sampled near a known spill that I know of, at least at our agency. Some of the groups we work with might have, like the Delaware River Basin Commission or some people out of that area, but I'm not aware of that for us at least.
That actually reminds me of a question that I had for Jess, which is, since your sampling seems to be tied more to responses to spills and known, pollution, is there a threshold for when you decide to sample? Like, just trying to understand what would trigger you to go out and sample, an environmental event or disaster.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing is we have like this area, also known as our jurisdiction, of like where we're responding to pollution incidents, which basically encompasses southwestern PA, so the Three Rivers, and their tributaries. So we'll respond to pollution incidents. This can be like if someone submits a pollution report to us in any of the areas that they see like industry polluting, but also like larger scale events. So like we responded to the farmer train derailment. If there is like a known reason to want to know, so like the reason we're sampling at Shell is with actually a professor at Pitt who is interested in knowing more about just PFAS contaminant. Also, it's like, is Shell using PFAS in their process? We kind of don't know, so we can look in the outfall. And then also at the East Palestine train wreck, sampled for PFAS out there. So kind of like when we think it could potentially be there, we're looking for it, but we are not doing like, it is not included in our standard sampling when we're going out at our targeted monitoring of like the bunch of sampling sites that we sample on each of the rivers.
Thanks, Jess.
Hi, Noel Randhell here with Environmental Water Resource Institute. Thank you everyone very much for this very informative presentation. I'm just curious about, we've been so focused on the effects to the fauna, but what about the flora? What happens with the plants in this cycle, and as these forever chemicals continue to get cycled through and through and through, like what other impacts can we expect with the plants and then everything that consumes those plants?
I'm not sure how the plant itself might be affected, but your second part about things consuming the plants, I know that is definitely something that people are researching, whether tree leaves get atmospheric deposition of PFAS or other plants get deposits of PFAS on them and then animals eat those plants. That's definitely an exposure route that's being studied, but I'm not sure about the actual, like, does it hurt the plant itself? I'm not as familiar with that question.
Yeah, I remember I was on a listening session with our EPA region, and they were discussing, I guess in rural areas, the biosolids that are spread on crop fields, like you said, that feed is eventually given to animals, and that's part of the whole process. So it's really interesting to think about plant uptake, or if there was research on, could this plant act as a sink for PFAS, similar to how the foam can act as a sink. So
Yeah, and I think there is research documenting plant uptake for sure, especially with certain crops and certain compounds. So
mhm.
some PFAS are going to be more likely to be in the water, which could then maybe be taken up by, say, a plant's vascular system into the plant, versus some PFAS don't like water, or they don't, none of them love water, but I always say like love or hate. Some of the compounds, what we call like short chain, might be more likely to be found in water, and that would be taken up by the plant. Some things that are maybe more long chain are going to be on your soil or your sediment or your biosolids. So there's definitely potential for that. And yeah, that biosolid question is so interesting to me. That's kind of where I want to go with PFAS in the future. I think that's a really big thing that we should be thinking about and tracking.
Thank you. And I know that like willow plants in particular, willow trees have been used to absorb heavy metals. I mean, is there possible ways to use plants to try and harvest some of these PFAS or capture?
Maybe. I mean, that
Hmm.
I feel like that could be a possibility. Um, something to look into for sure.
I'm going to move on to Jan's question here, which I think is might have been touched on a little bit, but is there, I think I actually asked you this earlier, I'm late. Is there a way to identify sources based on the types of compounds found in the water, compounds linked to one type of industry versus another? I guess in Jan's case, he's talking about our watershed, 9 Mile Run, because the sewage outfalls have a large contributing area. So it's hard to pick an one point source.
Yeah, so that's something that I was telling Aaron today. We have an entire group of researchers. We call them the proxies group that are trying to figure out if there are other compounds besides PFAS that might be indicating PFAS contamination or could be linked to PFAS contamination. So maybe you see like a suite of compounds that tells you that this is definitely contamination from a military base, or maybe you see a group that's telling you this is definitely contamination from a treatment plant. And is that a combination? Are those very specific compounds that are showing up? Is there a certain compound that we can use so that we don't even have to necessarily send all of our water samples off for PFAS? We just know if we see that there's PFAS contamination. All of those types of questions I feel like is the goal of this group, and they're in the midst of working through all of that right now. And I get what you're saying about the large area, because yeah, with a lot of these urban areas, even with when you think about urban runoff, it's kind of a diffuse source versus a point source, and that is a little bit harder to pinpoint. um, but for some of these major sources, I think we can maybe find this chemical signature in the near future, which would be really neat. I hope that kind of answers it. I guess we're working on it. We don't have any concrete answers, like a lot of science.
Yeah, I hope that is fruitful because that would save a lot of money in testing potentially, which we're also talking about today. So it looks like Ian says, is there any historical data that might indicate areas of rising or diminishing concern? How does your recent data connect to the limited prior data?
For our group, we only now have data back till 2019. So that's, I think that 5-year study will start to maybe get at some of that, but that's still only 5 years. I wish we had data for the last few decades, right? Since this has probably been an issue since the 40s. Um, so I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't think that we have a lot of historical data to go off of, at least in this region, or at least from our agency. Maybe other groups have been looking at this longer, especially areas that are near like 3M plants or Chemours plants. I'm sure they've got data that goes back further than we do. So, and maybe they are seeing improvements. I would hope that those plants have been forced to implement some type of treatment technology before discharging.
And that's interesting. You mentioned 3M and the plants too, because I know there were studies on humans back when they were first discovering, the issues with complications during pregnancy, and then they later found, well, this isn't just linked to pregnancy and a risk to the child. It's a risk to everyone. So be interested to see if any of those human health studies maybe could inform any of that too, but that might be a long shot.
I did just remember, I wanted to jump back to the previous question of like, are there ways to identify sources based on the compounds? In the Waterkeeper report that I linked, which also to answer this question, is there any historical data? The Waterkeeper report that I linked is the most extensive report done like across the US of PFAS testing. Again, it's like only minor testing, and that is like the first of its kind from in 2022. That sampling was done. So could happen again, but there's no previous data. But in the report I linked, it does kind of go into detail a little bit about some of the chemicals. So like PFOA and PFOS, and kind of like where they're most commonly found. And so like, for example, in this report, it says like, PFOA is most commonly used to make those like the Teflon pan coatings. So if you're finding that chemical, it's like maybe being used for that, but it's not all encompassing.
So I have one more question if nobody else wants to jump in. I know we've thrown a lot at you, Emily and Jess, but one last question that I have is regarding the newer generation of the Gen X chemicals and essentially how they've reworked the formulas. Are those more difficult to sample for? Have you like rephrase my question? Do you find them more and more often in higher amounts than other PFAS, or are they generally lower than the PFAS that have been around in the environment for 50 years rather than made in the past 10, 20 years?
We are just starting to see a couple detections of the Gen X compound at one of our Ohio River sites. But for the most part, we don't see them that much in the data that we've looked at thus far. But interesting that certain sites, they are starting to pop up at low concentrations. So they're not, I'd say, in the same range as the historical compounds like PFAS and PFOA. So occasionally we detect them, and when we do, the concentrations are not anything like super high, but it seems to be a little rare. Like I haven't seen them as much in surface water, so maybe they're also in other environmental compartments, which is not something I've looked at yet.
Yeah, you mentioned the longer chain and shorter chain, how that the chemical makeup can impact the transport. So that's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Yeah. So that's, well, not to go off topic, but that's what's so interesting about that foam study is that we're seeing longer chain PFAS compounds in foam that we never see in the surface water when we collect surface water samples. And sometimes you see that in sediment too. You'll see compounds in sediment that you never see when you're taking a surface water sample. So that chemistry, that chain length, like it really does drive where the chemicals are ending up in the environment, which is pretty cool. Well, not cool because it's kind of stinks that they're in the environment, but it's interesting scientifically.
Because our testing is like more limited, I can't really answer that question, but I will say when we did sampling at WSL for that leachate leak, so like kind of connected to the oil and gas waste that was in this leachate, there was a significantly higher concentration of the Gen X
Hmm.
chemicals. So like,
Interesting.
so like they were detectable and we saw them. So, I think further testing would have to be done to kind of build that correlation between oil and gas, like fracking using these PFAS chemicals, but also like the fracking boom in this region is relatively new. If you think about it within decades, it is quite new and they're still building well pads now in this region. So it is kind of a newer thing too.
Gives us a lot of pollution to study. Look at the positives, I guess. Anyone else? Any other final thoughts, questions for Emily or Jess or myself? All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate you making time and listening to two awesome presentations. We did record this, so we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel so you can share with your friends, family, anyone who else is interested in PFAS. And I will be following up with some resources from Emily and Jess probably tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great night.
Good night. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye.